My name is Kelmer, and I have just become the lead curator here at ALF. I'm also a former member or like selectee or participant in the Bridgework program, of which Ben and, oh my God, I got nervous too, Emily. It just went right out of my brain. This is my very first time. Are two of the four members of the Bridgework program. The other two will show in November. So what's going to happen is Emily's going to have your ear for about 30 minutes, and then we'll all hop over into the next gallery, and then Ben will have your ear. So thanks so much for coming, and you ready?
Yes, great. Thank you. Hi, hello everyone. I just want to start by, again, thanking everyone for coming this evening. I would also like to thank ALL and the Bridgework program for providing me the space and the opportunity to build this beautiful, in this beautiful space, build this body of work. I'd also like to thank my friends and family who drove kind of far away to be here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm just going to quick introduce myself and then talk a little bit about the themes of my artwork and kind of the overall themes, and then get into the specifics of Wallflower itself, and then talk a bit about each piece and kind of the process behind it and how they came to be. And then at the end, I'll have some time if anyone has any questions. So, hi, I'm Emily Rudolph. I grew up in Wisconsin. I went to high school in Sheboygan, and then I went to I completed my undergraduate degree at DePaul University, which is a small liberal arts school in Indiana. And then I came to Madison in 2016 for graduate school, where I completed my MFA in painting and drawing in 2019. I currently am the scenic artist at the university, where I work with undergraduate students to paint all the sets and the scenery for the school. Yeah, if you're interested in theater, we're doing 2 shows this spring. We're doing A Piece of My Heart, which opens in March, and then we're also doing Heather's musical, which is in April. So just a little bit about that. So I applied for the Bridgework program, I think, in end of July, and we were notified in August. So me and Ben learned in beginning of September that we'll be having a show in January. So I was like, oh my gosh, 4 months to build a body of work, which is fun, because these are not time consuming at all, really quick work. And so I worked on getting a studio, actually, because if anyone knows Phil Salomon, he runs Atwood Atelier, and there's a studio space right down the street. So I was able to build my body of work because I couldn't do it on the kitchen table or on the wall of my small apartment. Anyways, a bit about my work. When I'm looking at all my drawings and kind of just past bodies of work, there's 2 themes in particular that really stand out to me, and that is the home and patterns. So what is it about the home? Like, why am I interested in drawing the house? Well, I'm interested because I think people act a little bit different when they're inside versus how they act in the public sphere. There's like a way to be more free, a way to be yourself. And I'm also interested in how people, or how spaces affect how you feel, but also how people affect the spaces that they occupy. Like, for instance, the way people, for instance, a cluttered space, a cluttered workspace may make you feel a little bit more distracted or uncomfortable, or like you can't get anything done because it's so messy, versus, say, you walk into a room where it's empty and there's blank walls. You may feel more at ease or at peace. So I'm thinking about just how the patterns affect the space, or that's what I'm interested in, the home. Another thing that inspires me about the house, I think of colors and how certain colors affect your mood as well. When you think of like red, you may feel more anxious or angry, or maybe passion, or like when people paint their bedroom walls blue or green because it reminds them of the ocean or it reminds them of the forest. That's something that I'm interested in, is how color affects how you feel. So that's one big theme in a lot of my work, is home. The other one being the patterns, as you can tell. I would say that's like the main building block of all of my work. And like, what is a pattern? It's this like repetition of doing something over and over again. And sometimes when you think of pattern, you may think of decoration. Something to make something beautiful, to make something more interesting. What I like to think of pattern is it adds a level of complexity, and it adds something else to be looking at, something more interesting. Right now, I feel like there's kind of a trend for minimalism, where you just are thinking of like, just throw everything out, or like just focus on wearing one article of clothing. You don't need all these things. Well, I consider myself to be a maximalist. I like to fill the space. I like to use lots of color. I like to use all the color, and really just fill the space. So that's another interesting thing of pattern. So this brings me to Wallflower. So I'm thinking about, like, I knew it was going to be about the home, I knew it was going to be about pattern, but it wasn't really until I finished this third piece, actually right behind me, Petunia, that I realized what this body of work is really about. And it's about the fact that we've just stayed home for the past 2 years, and how my relationship with home has changed drastically. So I'm interested in the theme of home, but this work is about being at home and how this relationship has changed. It's not just the emotional roller coaster of being you're not just choosing to stay home anymore. We've had to stay home, and how does it feel to be kind of stuck? There's feelings of claustrophobia, of anxiety, of fear. But also on the other end, it's a sanctuary. It's a space away from all the other people and other scary things. So then you're left with just your thoughts. So in each of these pieces, it's just one person. There's no one else. And it's also just kind of it's about my own personal experience. A lot of sitting, a lot of being still, a lot of ruminating and thinking and obsessing. I think of my pattern making as kind of this repetitive movement, like repetitive thoughts, circular thinking. I think I fill this space with pattern as a way to deal with all these thoughts. And it's funny because the patterns themselves are very intricate and bold, and there's a lot going on. They're very activated, but I find making the patterns very calming and soothing. It's the only way that it eases my mind, is by drawing 1,000 circles over and over again, or filling a wide space with color, with markers, etc. One other way that I was able to kind of combat this needing to stay home, all these, ruminating thoughts, was by going on walks. It's like everything else is closed, so what do? I walked outside a lot, and in my drawings, what I realized is I was focused on the leaves and the trees and the things that are changing around you. I just noticed walking, just noticing the outside more when they're like, because it changes, whereas sometimes in your home it stays the same. So then I think of the two main characters in my work as being the home and the pattern, but definitely a supporting role would be plants. I feel like I purchased more plants. I wanted more flowers. I wanted to liven up my space, and they appeared in my drawings as well as in this body of work. So the first piece that I started with, I completed, this is Sage. Each of these pieces are named after flowers or herbs, but I also like to think of them as being like the names of the person in each of these pieces. They're all kind of me, but they're all kind of not me. Like it stems from my personal experience, but they're not by any means self-portraits. I would like to think other people could think of themselves, or just kind of, I think of them as characters, like I'm creating their own little worlds, their own rooms. And I wanted each piece to be about window size, kind of like you're glancing into a window, you're like observing people. Again, tied to the theme of home. So all of my works are done on mixed media paper, so it's heavy paper. This is the first one that I completed. It actually has an element of collage. So this plant right here is actually glued on. But it kept kind of like peeling away at the edges, and I kind of liked how it was falling off the work, or like the wall. And I was like, oh, I want to expand each piece onto the wall, and then I'm thinking, oh, it's about growth, it's about referencing kind of the outside. I wanted to fill this space. I think working in the theater has given me understanding working large or larger than life. I feel like it allows you to kind of enter the space a little bit more, be invited in and walk around the home. So after I finished this one, walk with me, here we go, because I did it chronologically. Okay, this over here is Poppy. This was the second piece that I completed. Actually, I traced myself for this one. I actually laid out the roll of paper and I sat down and I was tracing myself, and I was like looking, I felt ridiculous. I felt like a kid where you used to trace yourself with chalk. But I looked up and I realized that there's a skylight. I'm like, what would people think if they saw this? And then it kind of like it kind of grew into this observing, again, like different perspectives of looking, different ways of seeing. So this one, I also use acrylic paint, and also most of these are done with markers and acrylic paint. Markers are alcohol and ink-based. And then for this one, I was like painted black, and then I used gel pen on top to draw the pink flowers. While I was drawing them, well, one question I get asked a lot is like, how do you come up with these patterns? And the answer is, well, they kind of just grow and change. Like I might have an idea of like, oh, I want this to just be lines, or I want this to be shapes. But it's not until I really start drawing that I realize what it's going to look like, or what I want it to look like. I'm responding to how it grows, essentially, or how they expand. So for a while I thought this was going to be like a poppy field, hence kind of the poppy name, and then also popping bubbles with the black expanding outward. So after that one, I completed Petunia over here. For most of my pieces, I kind of like with patterns, I start with just a rough sketch. I kind of have an idea, like, oh, this one will have a window, or this will have a woman sitting in a chair, or I want a wall. But this one actually came to me in a dream. I'm not usually one to say I have like visions, but I think it was probably just that the show's been on my mind for so long that I was just constantly thinking about what I wanted to do. And I was just like, oh, a red piece. It has to be red. And I was thinking wallpaper, quadrants, a woman blending into the wallpaper. Of course, it didn't look anything like the thought that I originally have, which sometimes is the case when I've noticed as an artist, where you think it'll look really cool, but when you go down to paper, it doesn't look anything like it originally did. So that's with Petunia. Next piece that I finished is actually over here. This is ivy. So the material I used to kind of expand onto the wall is actually removable vinyl. It's like self-adhesive, so there's adhesive to all the vinyl that I cut. I bought them in large rolls and then cut them and stuck them to the wall. But this is the only piece in which I painted. I painted all the branches so that they're brown. This is also the only other piece that kind of references another person. Like they're all not just moments of like quiet solitude or contemplation about the world ending. They're also, this kind of references how, so like the fear of, I was thinking of kind of the nervousness of having someone enter the house and what that feels to be the public world kind of entering your private space. That was kind of the idea behind that one. And then, yeah, lastly, we have Rose. Each of these pieces roughly, I also get asked often how long each pieces take, and I think a long time, between like 60 and 80 hours. So this was the last piece that I completed and is actually how I got the title for Wallflower. As I was working on it, I realized that the pattern kind of started to grow onto her, or how she was blending into the wall. And I just thought about those moments of sometimes where you sit in a place for too long, like your foot falls asleep, or you almost feel like you're turning into your surroundings, or is that just me? I don't know. But that's kind of sometimes how I felt being home all the time. It's like, am I just turning into the wallpaper? Am I just growing here? So that was Rose. The last one, the largest one. And I don't say I have favorites, but this one might be my favorite. So Wallflower in general is this kind of a culmination of how I dealt with these kind of changing circumstances and changing relationship to the home, being at home, and also, well, in one way, it's filling it with pattern and plants, essentially, was my cure for that. So thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Oh yeah, the only one that was really, I used collage in this piece, this plant was the first piece that is glued on right now. So, yes. I thought I was going to do more collage elements, but then it was only on this one. Yes?
So it's great to hear your process and how much time you invest in each of these pieces. You mentioned 60 to 80 hours, right, for each of them. Do you view these patterns as a sort of timekeeping device? Can you look at a specific pattern, looking back and say, oh, that took me 8 hours, or do you ever translate these patterns into moments in time?
Ooh, that's a great question. No, well, I do realize I don't do it by I don't think of them in terms of numbers necessarily, of oh, that one was roughly 8 hours, or that one. But I do realize that it's taking me a really long time when I start to get a little bored with it. I'm like, oh, I must have been working on this one for 2 days now. I'm I just want it to be filled. But that's when I'm like, oh, this one's a long one or a big pattern. Versus Yeah, there's a few quick ones, but I can never measure them specifically. I started to like take count of how long I spent on each piece, but then it was hard to tally 5 minutes. You know, and I just did a quick thing to be like, oh, what's 10 minutes on this one versus 20 minutes on this one. Yes?
I'm kind of curious, so how did you decide what elements to expand into the gallery on the wall with the vinyl versus, like, 'cause some of them are more geometrical, obviously, and some of them are more organic. And I know that was kind of like not a rush decision necessarily, but it was something that you were doing like in the moment. So I was just wondering how you use your judgment and what shapes.
Sure. Yeah, so there's the first two drawings that I did, the ones that are kind of across from each other, I knew for a while what the element was going to be. I think I've had those for months. I had an idea of expanding, because I think this piece right here kind of comes off the frame, and so I was like, oh, what if I wish I could make it bigger, but it was already completed. But I didn't want to tape on or glue on paper, so I was like, what if I just made it a part of wherever it lives? And then I was like, oh, it'd be interesting if some were about lines and others were more shape-based. Yeah, but I didn't realize until I was in the space what exactly I was going to do for the last three. I love to procrastinate. So then but I feel like it was always an idea, but it wasn't until it actually happened what I knew. You know, playing like, oh, I'm just gonna paint the walls, turn out fine, but then I'm like, oh no, I'm not. I'm using vinyl. What colors are available? That was a huge thing too, a little bit. What colors I wanted to use. But I like on three of them now. They kind of are built-in frames in some ways, instead of actually framing them or kind of keeping them to the the corners of the paper. I like that they're all framed, but not in a traditional sense, because it's a frame, but it's kind of a loose-ended frame, a gesture of a frame. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then Ben will be giving a talk over the next room if you'd like to make your way over there.
Yes, so hi everyone. Second bridge work artist, 2 out of 4. Ben Orozco. I would like to also start with a small land acknowledgement for the Ho-Chunk people. A lot of the work that I'm going to be covering talks about monocultures, and so one of the things that I also want to point attention to is just in creating a lot of the landscapes that you'll see here, there's definitely some displacement or some sort of movement that has happened within that. So I just wanted to point that out before I start. So hi, I'm Ben. I am an artist and also a designer. These are 2 images of me as a baby in my childhood home in Miami, Florida. So this is one of my dad's sculptures. He was a ceramicist and my mom was a graphic designer. So a lot of my experiences are kind of grounded between these 2 worlds. And I always love to pull this image up. This is a drawing that I made on Photoshop, and what I love about having this childhood image is that it comes with metadata. So I can actually get to see the year and the date that I made this file. I found this on an old computer that I had. And I like this image just in terms of what it symbolizes for me, in terms of how I make sense of the world and how I create images and how I think through my surroundings and my environment. So a lot of my works will oftentimes be some sort of reflection on how I am looking at my surroundings and my spaces. I moved up here from my Miami home when I was about 8 years old, and my family kind of split up. And since then, I've always had this really strong affinity towards the landscape there. A lot of what I've been thinking about has been, how do I capture and make sense of this space that I'm no longer a part of, and how do I relate to that space? So this is a ghillie suit that I made a year ago. I usually get to go home about once a year, get to go see my family. I get to reconnect with a space that is somewhat lush to me, somewhat warm to me. This is another image just of the ghillie suit and my sort of embodiment of that space. You can also see this on the 3rd floor of the Art Lit Lab. And with that too comes in some of my backgrounds now as both a graphic designer and somebody who's working in art and sculpture, in drawing, and so a lot of my solutions to these spaces involve coming up with drawings or systems. I realize now that pretty much everything I make is in some sort of grid or some sort of system of interrelated objects. So you get to see some of those components from the ghillie suit that I was making. This is from my first solo exhibition, which I did in 2017, titled Tropicalia. So I'm kind of jumping around time right now, but the ideas are pretty linear in terms of how they flow. So even with these ideas of landscapes that sometimes I can't relate to as specifically or particularly, I'm still making sense of these sometimes imaginary foliage, like this is really strange shapes. Bringing in some of the new technical languages that I learned being at UW. Shout out to my professor, Helen Lee, for being here. I am able to marry some of these ideas in terms of how I relate to space, and what this led me into was how I think about and process space. So, being in this digital environment, being also in this space that I'm not always connected to, I started growing this affinity for uncanny spaces, and what you're looking at right now is one of my favorite visual phenomena, or maybe a visual theorem of visual processing. So a lot of what I do oftentimes is thinking about breaking something down and putting it back together. And so this is David Marr's 2.5 dimensions. I love this drawing in terms of how it's breaking down some of those spaces from just a flat input image that we're looking at. These are primal sketches, so this is another illustration that's just showing how we sometimes deconstruct and initially break apart what we're looking at into these very simple lines. I love this idea and gesture of just simplifying and condensing down visual information. But also too, thinking about visual processing as well. And this graph is just gonna look really weird. You're like, okay, what's going on? I see stimulus, I see full field, you see all of these different donuts here, but what I like about this phenomenon, which I learned somewhat recently, is just how our eyes love lines. And you can see the image on the far right, the one that says surround only. It's showing here some of the neural activity. You can see that this line is pretty straight when things are dark, light, and you can actually notice that the activity goes down a little bit for the surround effect, which is basically our eyes are pretty used to this simplified form of seeing. Like, it actually brings down our neural activity, which I really love. And so this kind of goes into some of my work that I made leading up to the show. You'll notice this fun little visual optical illustration. And then you'll also see too some of the sculptures that I work with, working with light, working with neon. What I like about it is that it is such a flattening force, and you can see that as well in this sculpture that I have in the gallery, Stag 5. But ultimately what I love about working with light is just being able to create something that is both that flat 2D and that 3D simultaneously. And so I am really drawn to these weird conundrums that happen visually. This is another fun image. This is a Dazzle Camouflage, and this is a very fun kind of simple Dazzle Camouflage. It's not a very aggressive one, but one other thing that I love in terms of visual processing is surface, and this is a prototype vehicle here. You can see it's been emblazoned with this lovely black and white pattern, which oftentimes makes it hard to decipher the depth of an image, you know, what kind of substance is actually there on the surface. And so if you're a car maker, you probably don't want people to know all the exact dimensions. And this kind of leads up to some of the work that I did leading up to my bridge work experience. After I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I did go to Sweden to do a 9-month project studying glass techniques in both neon and also this engraving process called Rudolph. So really finding that visual effect and playing with where our eyes go, what our eyes see, and how we perceive space. But also not letting go of that process of working with light. I think ultimately, I love just the ability of this uncanny space to actually exist, and ultimately how we consume it with our eyes. This is a pretty flat, simple image, but in the same body of work. And so also too, thinking about how we exist and operate in a grid too. It was really interesting in August when we first started this experience, Facebook's Meta was announced, and I've been reflecting on that now, especially in terms of how our spaces are flattening. I'm going to get to the monoculture aspect, but thinking about it too in terms of how we relate to our spaces is something that is really important to me too. And so this is just the XYZ axis, a sort of way to calibrate how we are in space and how we operate. Next one. And so with that idea of the bridgework program, I wanted an opportunity to maybe take a look back home and figure out what it is about this landscape in particular that is connecting to me and also reflected in some of the works that I previously made. And so I started looking into my own landscapes here in Wisconsin. And this is actually a poster that I designed in school, but didn't really think about much at the time. I realize now that these contours offer me something that is a little bit interesting in terms of how unnatural it is and connecting to this other idea of the grid and what it can do. And so this is a drone image that my mom helped me take earlier this year before autumn struck and the corn was harvested. And so I started to document and go back into my archives of what imagery of monocultures I had, and I started looking at the palm tree plantations that I had grown up around in South Miami and didn't really think much about aside from, oh, that's cool, and oh, I'm home, I love it. And I was just thinking about now how gridded, you know, working with grids and sculptures, how flattened these landscapes were. I mean, how unchaotic these landscapes were. And as I was doing my research, I discovered that you can go beyond the Google Maps. And I started discovering this GIS or Geographical Information Service, which sometimes can offer these incredibly detailed images from satellites, depending on what sort of layer or encoding you want. And then I started discovering this really high resolution depictions of some of the landscapes that I was growing up around, and just realizing how ordered and how gridded these landscapes were. This is a fun one, just in terms of how much the shadow and the actual tree itself are blending into each other. And it's also a really nice sharp one. I think it might be fruit trees, but I'm not sure. These could be orange trees. All located in Homestead, Florida. fun one too that's in the copy. And so I was thinking about this idea of perspective, not just from me standing in the space, but looking at it, you know, from a satellite, thinking about it just from so far away. And I came across something else which I was really intrigued about. So you can see that these two images are of the same thing. They're the United States. This is a specific image from the US Geographical Service. And one thing I started realizing is just that a lot of the satellite images and GIS data that's used is all captured in this binary of black or white, and then it's recomposed or reassembled. So this image is maybe not going to show up the best, but what I find so fascinating about this is just how each of these images is just comprised of all of these separate channels that have been put together. So I have here a visual of the southern tip of Florida, and you can see here that they're varying in different shades, but they are ultimately the same image. And I just love that idea of this flattened initial perspective that kind of gets put together, but seeing this as ultimately the shadow as like the first view or the first impression of what we're looking at, and thinking back to that optical perspective and the optical visual encoding and the flattening of space in terms of what happens when a single organism or a single tree is repeated in series. And so instead of depicting things just from my hand, I was also looking at what the shadows can do here. These moments where these trees start to not look tree-like at all, and these really strange impressions that are created by the landscape. You can see this in the newsprint that I've created for the show. I've sort of been going back and forth between breaking down these elements and pulling out the uncanny. And then, what I love about getting to be in a program like UW-Madison is getting to pick up all these really random technical abilities, like working in a 3D environment, and getting to reassemble some of these really broken down, really black or white, either arid soil or palm tree that will be replanted somewhere else, and then moving around in a virtual environment, looking from different perspectives, until I finally reached that final image that you see on the wall, and building it out to fill the space. Also assembling it from a paper-like, but not paper substance of Tyvek. So what you're ultimately looking at in this gallery space is a 2D depiction of a 3D environment of a 2D image. So looking back at that perspective too, this is just a soybean field, which is referenced in these pieces over here, this really dramatic angling as we have rows of soy and maybe young corn reaching out into the horizon. And then also creating that in its own 3D environment, picking out two different perspectives from the east and from the south, comprised of more than 2,000 separate seed plantings. And I'm really happy that I get to show this work in the winter, because I start to see this coming out of the soil itself, you know, as everything is blanketed. Also going back to the ghostly contours, which you can see here in this sculpture in SAG 5. And the humanness of it. I ultimately am really happy that I was provided the opportunity to work in such a big scale, because ultimately I'm just working in shadow and space from different perspectives. This is some of the newsprints that I mentioned before. Please take one, because I have many in this initial edition of 250. And so along with this, I also had the opportunity to speak with an agroeconomist. I did make a YouTube video, since we are in the 21st century, and it is 2022, so if you want to hear us have a conversation about how we both view and organize and make sense of such a chaotic but controlled process, I have here an image of the USDA cropland data layer, which creates these colorful maps that pretty much just aggregate and divide up entire landscapes into, we have this orange corn, I'm guessing, with green soybean, pink something, but everything comprised in these 30 by 30 meter pixels. This is what his version of compressing reality looks like, whereas mine might be working in a Rhino document, running with regressions and creating and organizing information from separate perspectives. And also these crop rotations, which come from Mississippi, so we get to see these colorful colors again. So yeah, thank you to Jolene, thanks to the Bridgework program, and also Amy and Matea, who are in attendance. Thank you so much for helping me put this work together. I would not have been able to do something so cool like this without you. I know I definitely went through a lot, so like if you want me to go back to anything, I will happily do so and like unpack the work, but yeah, I'm really happy to see you in this space.
I'll ask a not super interesting question, just because I feel like I heard the timeline earlier, and the kind of research whole of monoculture was majority of that a fairly recent rapid development, or long like when did you start diving into that?
I would say it's always been in the back of my head. I grew up on a farm, so these, let's see, like this image here is my backyard, which I also forgot to mention. And you know, ever since a young age, our family has been invested in the idea of conservation and you know what happens to a piece of property if it doesn't turn into a cornfield or a house. So you know, throughout high school, I was the president of my ecology club in high school. Like I've always been thinking about this stuff. I realized when I was thinking about this abstraction of space that it had been in front of me this whole time. So I did do a lot of that initial research into things like seed spacing, which I did not bring up as I was constructing this work, but I did look into, you know, if I did want to create my own little monoculture field, like, or, you know, monoculture plot like this to scale, how far would I need to place everything in order to, quote unquote, maximize the yield of that thing? I would say I started looking very closely, yeah, starting in August. But ultimately, it has been percolating in the back of my head for pretty much like my whole life. Or at least since I moved up here. Yes.
You're so involved with the landscape and large spaces as well as pixels.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you're ever thought about actually creating a space in the landscape.
Yes, I have. I think yesterday or the day before, I discovered my mom, who does a lot of the maintenance and stewardship of our family farm, has a forestry products catalog, and I discovered this land surveil material. So I think there are things like lines and papers that are meant to be used for observing from such a high altitude. So I'm really excited about that because, you know, the material in this piece is made out of a Tyvek, which is something that you often see in home coverings, or if you're shipping artwork or shipping things in envelopes, that this is something that is meant to be very paper-like, but also be indestructible as it's made out of plastic. But I've discovered a paper-like material that can be used in a larger scale and actually degrade to some extent. So I'm really excited about that discovery and all of this like optical calibration and you know, trying to make sense of something from really close and really far away as well. Emily.
So you work, I realize you use a lot of digital images.
Right.
In your work. Was it difficult to translate digital images into 2D information, or like was that process difficult, or translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think like one reason why I brought up that image of me being on a computer is I think I make a lot of sense of my world through mediating through like some sort of digital space too. So, you know, in the process of putting this show together, I also actually made a model of the space and figured out how I could construct everything, you know, within the space itself. Like there's a point where you can just kind of move things around and you can pretty much just create and like simulate realities pretty quickly, which is really fun.
It's sort of a dumb material question, but can you talk about this heated Tyvek?
Yes.
Like a little glitter sparkle in it?
It has like a little crinkle in it, yeah. So Tyvek, it's, I think I can go back to my very rough blue tape image and version. So it is kind of porous, and all the palm trees that I created here were initially white Tyvek, and I picked this just because I wanted to create like a matter surface, but I painted this, and this is like a semi-woven, but not really woven plastic fiber, and so when I'm painting in it, it's the fiber is like holding the paint, and I was using a roller for some of this. I mean, I had to work pretty quickly because 4 months. But I was pushing the paint in, and I think there were some moments where either some of the texture of that fiber came out, or it was the finishing and curing of the paint. And you know, I was working with something really huge, so I used water-based glues and water-based paint so that I could kind of command Z on some of those things. Yeah. Kel.
Yeah. I'm super interested in like the whole technical process of it and the information and the research. I was wondering though if you could elaborate a little bit on, because I know that you said at the beginning that your family's split between Miami and Wisconsin, and so you have the palm trees here as well as like soybeans and things that are more regional here.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about having those two regions in the same room or in the same show with the palm trees and these other crops.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to look at a field of corn and be like, okay, this is corn, great, we're gonna eat this, like it's gonna go in a tractor. But what I like about working with the palm tree imagery is that it's like even more weird and bizarre in terms of the supply chain, if we're going to go back to the idea of economics and like who's going to buy what and where is this product actually going to live. The fact that trees like this oftentimes get containerized, shipped somewhere else and replanted, like that is the definition of uncanny. You know, it's not something, the tree didn't come from that. Sometimes I look at trees outside and I'm like, I have no idea where these came from. And so I thought that was like a really eerie, if I'm thinking about this idea of uncanny landscapes or like really weird simulated spaces, I feel like this is perfect because we all view the palm tree in some sort of symbolic way. And I think what's interesting having it in this grid is that it is, yes, very digital, but it's still something that exists and is rooted in reality. Any other questions? I think we're good. Well, thank you again. Thanks everyone for coming, and I'm really happy to see you all here.